Chapter 11. Somewhat later in the day they went out for a stroll through the town together. To Herminia's great relief, Alan never even noticed she had been crying. Man-like, he was absorbed in his own delight. She would have felt herself a traitor if Alan had discovered it. "Which way shall we go?" she asked listlessly, with a glance to right and left as they passed beneath the sombre Tuscan gate of their palazzo. And Alan answered, smiling, "Why, what does it matter? Which way you like. Every way is a picture." And so it was, Herminia herself was fain to admit, in a pure painter's sense, that didn't at all attract her. Lines grouped themselves against the sky in infinite diversity. Whichever way they turned, quaint old walls met their eyes, and tumble-down churches, and mouldering towers, and mediaeval palazzi with carved doorways or rich loggias. But whichever way they turned, dusty roads too confronted them, illimitable stretches of gloomy suburb, unwholesome airs, sickening sights and sounds and perfumes. Narrow streets swept darkling under pointed archways that framed distant vistas of spire or campanile, silhouetted against the solid blue sky of Italy. The crystal hardness of that sapphire firmament repelled Herminia. They passed beneath the triumphal arch of Augustus with its Etruscan mason-work, its Roman decorations, and round the antique walls aglow with tufted gillyflowers to the bare Piazza d'Armi. A cattle fair was going on there, and Alan pointed with pleasure to the curious fact that the oxen were all cream-coloured, the famous white steers of Clitumnus. Herminia knew her Virgil as well as Alan himself, and murmured half aloud the sonorous hexameter, "Romanos ad templa Deum duxere triumphos." But somehow the knowledge that these were indeed the milk-white bullocks of Clitumnus failed amid so much dust to arouse her enthusiasm. She would have been better pleased just then with a yellow English primrose. They clambered down the terraced ravines sometimes, a day or two later, to arid banks by a dry torrent's bed, where Italian primroses really grew, interspersed with tall grape hyacinths and scented violets and glossy cleft leaves of winter aconite. But even the primroses were not the same thing to Herminia as those she used to gather on the dewy slopes of the Redlands. They were so dry and dust-grimed, and the path by the torrent's side was so distasteful and unsavoury. Bare white boughs of twisted fig trees depressed her. Besides, these hills were steep, and Herminia felt the climbing. Nothing in city or suburbs attracted her soul. Etruscan volumnii, each lolling in white travertine on the sculptured lid of his own sarcophagus urn, and all duly ranged in the twilight of their tomb at their spectral banquet, stirred her heart but feebly. St. Francis, Santa Chiara, fell flat on her English fancy. But as for Alan, he revelled all day long in his native element. He sketched every morning among the huddled, strangled lanes, sketched churches and monasteries and portals of palazzi, sketched mountains clear-cut in that pellucid air, till Herminia wondered how he could sit so long in the broiling sun or keen wind on those bare hillsides, or on broken brick parapets in these noisome byways. But your born sketcher is oblivious of all on earth save his chosen art, and Alan was essentially a painter in fibre, diverted by pure circumstance into a chancery practice. The very pictures in the gallery failed to interest Herminia, she knew not why. Alan couldn't rouse her to enthusiasm over his beloved Buonfigli. Those naive flaxen-haired angels with sweetly parted lips and baskets of red roses in their delicate hands own sisters though they were to the girlish Lippies she had so admired at Florence, moved her heart but faintly. Try as she might to like them, she responded to nothing Perugian in any way. At the end of a week or two, however, Alan began to complain of constant headache. He was looking very well, but grew uneasy and restless. Herminia advised him to give up sketching for a while, those small streets were so close, and he promised to yield to her wishes in the matter. Yet he grew worse next day, so that Herminia, much alarmed, called in an Italian doctor. Perugia boasted no English one. The Italian felt his pulse and listened to his symptoms. "The signore came here from Florence?" he asked. "From Florence," Herminia assented, with a sudden sinking. The doctor protruded his lower lip. "This is typhoid fever," he said after a pause. "A very bad type. It has been assuming such a form this winter at Florence." He spoke the plain truth. 21 days before, in his bedroom at the hotel in Florence, Alan had drunk a single glass of water from the polluted springs that supply in part the Tuscan metropolis. For 21 days those victorious microbes had brooded in silence in his poisoned arteries. At the end of that time, they swarmed and declared themselves. He was ill with an aggravated form of the most deadly disease that still stalks unchecked through unsanitated Europe. Herminia's alarm was painful. Alan grew rapidly worse. In 2 days he was so ill that she thought it her duty to telegraph at once to Dr. Merrick in London, "Alan's life in danger. Serious attack of Florentine typhoid. Italian doctor despairs of his life. May not last till tomorrow. Herminia Barton." Later on in the day came a telegram in reply. It was addressed to Alan. "Am on my way out by through train to attend you. But as a matter of duty, marry the girl at once and legitimatise your child while the chance remains to you." It was kindly meant in its way. It was a message of love, of forgiveness, of generosity, such as Herminia would hardly have expected from so stern a man as Alan had always represented his father to be to her. But at moments of unexpected danger, angry feelings between father and son are often forgotten, and blood unexpectedly proves itself thicker than water. Yet even so, Herminia couldn't bear to show the telegram to Alan. She feared lest in this extremity, his mind weakened by disease, he might wish to take his father's advice and prove untrue to their common principles. In that case, woman that she was, she hardly knew how she could resist what might be only too probably his dying wishes. Still, she nerved herself for this trial of faith, and went through with it bravely. Alan, though sinking, was still conscious at moments. In one such interval, with an effort to be calm, she showed him his father's telegram. Tears rose into his eyes. "I didn't expect him to come," he said. "This is all very good of him." Then, after a moment, he added, "Would you wish me, in this extremity, Hermy, to do as he advises?" Herminia bent over him with fierce tears on her eyelids. "Oh, Alan, darling," she cried, "you mustn't die. You mustn't leave me. What could I do without you? Oh, my darling, my darling! But don't think of me now. Don't think of the dear baby. I couldn't bear to disturb you even by showing you the telegram. For your sake, Alan, I'll be calm, I'll be calm. But oh, not for worlds, not for worlds, even so. Would I turn my back on the principles we would both risk our lives for?" Alan smiled a faint smile. "Hermy," he said slowly, "I love you all the more for it. You're as brave as a lion. Oh, how much I have learned from you." All that night and next day Herminia watched by his bedside. Now and again he was conscious, but for the most part he lay still in a comatose condition, with eyes half closed, the whites showing through the lids, neither moving nor speaking. All the time he grew worse steadily. As she sat by his bedside, Herminia began to realise the utter loneliness of her position. That Alan might die was the one element in the situation she had never even dreamt of. No wife could love her husband with more perfect devotion than Herminia loved Alan. She hung upon every breath with unspeakable suspense and unutterable affection. But the Italian doctor held out little hope of a rally. Herminia sat there, fixed to the spot, a white marble statue. Late next evening, Dr Merrick reached Perugia. He drove straight from the station to the dingy flat in the morose palazzo. At the door of his son's room, Herminia met him, clad from head to foot in white, as she had sat by the bedside. Tears blinded her eyes. Her face was wan, her mien terribly haggard. "And my son?" the doctor asked, with a hushed breath of terror. "He died half an hour ago," Herminia gasped out with an effort. "But he married you before he died?" the father cried in a tone of profound emotion. "He did justice to his child? He repaired his evil?" "He did not," Herminia answered in a scarcely audible voice. "He was staunch to the end to his lifelong principles." "Why not?" the father asked, staggering. "Did he see my telegram?" "Yes," Herminia answered, numb with grief, yet too proud to prevaricate. "But I advised him to stand firm, and he abode by my decision." The father waved her aside with his hands imperiously. "Then I have done with you," he exclaimed. "I am sorry to seem harsh to you at such a moment, but it is your own doing. You leave me no choice. You have no right any longer in my son's apartments." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. No position in life is more terrible to face than that of the widowed mother left alone in the world with her unborn baby. When the child is her first one, when, besides the natural horror and agony of the situation, she has also to confront the unknown dangers of that new and dreaded experience, her plight is still more pitiable. But when the widowed mother is one who has never been a wife, when in addition to all these pangs of bereavement and fear, she has further to face the contempt and hostility of a sneering world, as Herminia had to face it, then indeed her lot becomes well nigh insupportable. It is almost more than human nature can bear up against. So Herminia found it. She might have died of grief and loneliness then and there, had it not been for the sudden and unexpected rousing of her spirit of opposition by Dr Merrick's words. That cruel speech gave her the will and the power to live. It saved her from madness. She drew herself up at once with an injured woman's pride, and facing her dead Alan's father with a quick access of energy. "You are wrong," she said, stilling her heart with one hand. "These rooms are mine, my own, not dear Alan's. I engaged them myself for my own use, and in my own name. as Herminia Barton. You can stay here if you wish. I will not imitate your cruelty by refusing you access to them. But if you remain here, you must treat me at least with the respect that belongs to my great sorrow, and with the courtesy due to an English lady." Her words half cowed him. He subsided at once. In silence, he stepped over to his dead son's bedside. Mechanically, almost unconsciously, Herminia went on with the needful preparations for Alan's funeral. Her grief was so intense that she bore up as if stunned. She did what was expected of her without thinking or feeling it. Dr Merrick stopped on at Perugia till his son was buried. He was frigidly polite, meanwhile, to Herminia. Deeply as he differed from her, the dignity and pride with which she had answered his first insult impressed him with a certain sense of respect for her character, and made him feel at least he could not be rude to her with impunity. He remained at the hotel and superintended the arrangements for his son's funeral. As soon as that was over, and Herminia had seen the coffin lowered into the grave of all her hopes, save one, she returned to her rooms alone, more utterly alone than she had ever imagined any human being could feel in a cityful of fellow creatures. She must shape her path now for herself without Alan's aid, without Alan's advice. And her bitterest enemies in life, she felt sure, would henceforth be those of Alan's household. Yet, lonely as she was, she determined from the first moment no course was left open for her save to remain at Perugia. She couldn't go away so soon from the spot where Alan was laid, from all that remained to her now of Alan, except his unborn baby, the baby that was half his, half hers, the baby predestined to regenerate humanity. Oh, how she longed to fondle it! Every arrangement had been made in Perugia for the baby's advent. She would stand by those arrangements still, in her shuttered room, partly because she couldn't tear herself away from Alan's grave, partly because she had no heart left to make the necessary arrangements elsewhere, but partly also because she wished Alan's baby to be born near Alan's side, where she could present it after birth at its father's last resting place. It was a fanciful wish, she knew, based upon ideas she had long since discarded, but these ancestral sentiments echo long in our hearts. They die hard with us all, and most hard with women. She would stop on at Perugia, and die in giving birth to Alan's baby, or else live to be father and mother in one to it. So she stopped and waited in tremulous fear, half longing for death, half eager not to leave that sacred baby an orphan. It would be Alan's baby, and might grow in time to be the world's true saviour. For now that Alan was dead, no hope on earth seemed too great to cherish for Alan's child within her. And oh, that it might be a girl, to take up the task she herself had failed in. The day after the funeral, Dr Merrick called in for the last time at her lodgings. He brought in his hand a legal-looking paper, which he had found in searching among Alan's effects, for he had carried them off to his hotel, leaving not even a memento of her ill-starred love to Herminia. "This may interest you," he said dryly. "You will see at once it is in my son's handwriting." Herminia glanced over it with a burning face. It was a will in her favour, leaving absolutely everything of which he died possessed, To my beloved friend, Herminia Barton. Herminia had hardly the means to keep herself alive till her baby was born, but in those first fierce hours of ineffable bereavement, what question of money could interest her in any way? She stared at it, stupefied. It only pleased her to think Alan had not forgotten her. The sordid, moneyed class of England will haggle over bequests and settlements and dowries on their bridal eve, or by the coffins of their dead. Herminia had no such ignoble possibilities. How could he speak of it in her presence at a moment like this? How obtrude such themes on her august sorrow? "This was drawn up," Dr Merrick went on in his austere voice, "the very day before my late son left London, but of course you will have observed it was never executed." And in point of fact, Herminia now listlessly noted that it lacked Alan's signature. "That makes it, I need hardly say, of no legal value," the father went on with frigid calm. "I bring it round merely to show you that my son intended to act honourably towards you. As things stand, of course, he has died intestate, and his property, such as it is, will follow the ordinary law of succession. For your sake, I am sorry it should be so. I could have wished it otherwise. However, I need not remind you," he picked his phrases carefully with icy precision, "that under circumstances like these, neither you nor your child have any claim whatsoever upon my son's estate. Nor have I any right over it. Still—" he paused for a second, and that incisive mouth strove to grow gentle, while Herminia, hot with shame, confronted him helplessly. "I sympathise with your position, and do not forget it was Alan who brought you here. Therefore, as an act of courtesy to a lady in whom he was personally interested, if a slight gift of £50 would be of immediate service to you in your present situation, why, I think, with the approbation of his brothers and sisters, who of course inherit—" Herminia turned upon him like a wounded creature. She thanked the blind caprice which governs the universe that it gave her strength at that moment to bear up under his insult. With one angry hand she waved dead Alan's father inexorably to the door. "Go!" she said simply. "How dare you? How dare you? Leave my rooms this instant." Dr Merrick, still irresolute, and anxious in his way to do what he thought was just, drew a roll of Italian bank-notes from his waistcoat pocket and laid them on the table. "You may find these useful," he said, as he retreated awkwardly. Herminia turned upon him with the just wrath of a great nature outraged. "Take them up!" she cried fiercely. "Don't pollute my table!" Then, as often happens to all of us in moments of deep emotion, a scripture phrase, long hallowed by childish familiarity, rose spontaneous to her lips. "Take them up!" she cried again. "Thy money perish with thee!" Dr Merrick took them up and slunk noiselessly from the room, murmuring as he went some inarticulate words to the effect that he had only desired to serve her. As soon as he was gone, Herminia's nerve gave way. She flung herself into a chair and sobbed long and violently. It was no time for her, of course, to think about money. Sore pressed as she was, she had just enough left to see her safely through her confinement. Alan had given her a few pounds for housekeeping when they first got into the rooms, and those she kept. They were hers. She had not the slightest impulse to restore them to his family. All he left was hers too by natural justice, and she knew it. He had drawn up his will, attestation clause and all, with even the very date inserted in pencil, the day before they quitted London together, but finding no friends at the club to witness it, he had put off executing it, and so had left Herminia entirely to her own resources. In the delirium of his fever, the subject never occurred to him, but no doubt existed as to the nature of his last wishes, and if Herminia herself had been placed in a similar position to that of the Merrick family, she would have scorned to take so mean an advantage of the mere legal omission. By this time, of course, the story of her fate had got across to England, and was being read and retold by each man or woman after his or her own fashion. The papers mentioned it as seen through the optic lens of the society journalist, with what strange refraction! Most of them descried in poor Herminia's tragedy nothing but material for a smile, a sneer, or an innuendo. The Dean himself wrote to her a piteous, paternal note which bowed her down more than ever in her abyss of sorrow. He wrote as a dean must, grey hairs brought down with sorrow to the grave, infinite mercy of heaven, still room for repentance, but oh, to keep away from her pure young sisters. Herminia answered with dignity, but with profound emotion. She knew her father too well not to sympathise greatly with his natural view of so fatal an episode. So she stopped on alone for her dark hour in Perugia. She stopped on, untended by any save unknown Italians whose tongue she hardly spoke, and uncheered by a friendly voice at the deepest moment of trouble in a woman's history. Often for hours together she sat alone in the cathedral, gazing up at a certain mild-featured Madonna enshrined above an altar. The unwedded widow seemed to gain some comfort from the pitying face of the maiden mother. Every day, while still she could, she walked out along the shadeless suburban road to Alan's grave in the parched and crowded cemetery. Women trudging along with crammed creels on their backs turned round to stare at her. When she could no longer walk, she sat at her window towards San Luca and gazed at it. There lay the only friend she possessed in Perugia, perhaps in the universe. The dreaded day arrived at last, and her strong constitution enabled Herminia to live through it. Her baby was born, a beautiful little girl, soft, delicate, wonderful, with Alan's blue eyes and its mother's complexion. Those rosy feet saved Herminia. As she clasped them in her hands, tiny feet, tender feet, she felt she had now something left to live for. Her baby, Alan's baby, the baby with a future, the baby that was destined to regenerate humanity. So warm, so small, Alan's soul and her own, mysteriously blended. Still, even so, she couldn't find it in her heart to give any joyous name to dead Alan's child. Dolores, she called it at Alan's grave. In sorrow had she borne it. Its true name was Dolores. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. It was a changed London to which Herminia returned. She was homeless, penniless, friendless. Above all, she was déclassée. The world that had known her now knew her no more. Women who had smothered her with their Judas kisses passed her by in their victorias with a stony stare. Even men pretended to be looking the other way, or crossed the street to avoid the necessity for recognising her. So awkward to be mixed up with such a scandal. She hardly knew as yet herself how much her world was changed indeed. For had she not come back to it, the mother of an illegitimate daughter? But she began to suspect it the very first day when she arrived at Charing Cross, clad in a plain black dress, with her baby at her bosom. Her first task was to find rooms, her next to find a livelihood. Even the first involved no small relapse from the purity of her principles. After long hours of vain hunting, she found at last she could only get lodgings for herself and Alan's child by telling a virtual lie, against which her soul revolted. She was forced to describe herself as Mrs. Barton. She must allow her landlady to suppose she was really a widow. Woe unto you, scribes and hypocrites! In all Christian London, Miss Barton and her baby could never have found a respectable room in which to lay their heads. So she yielded to the inevitable, and took 2 tiny attics in a small street off the Edgware Road at a moderate rental. To live alone in a cottage as of yore would have been impossible now she had a baby of her own to tend, besides earning her livelihood. She fell back regretfully on the lesser evil of lodgings. To earn her livelihood was a hard task, though Herminia's indomitable energy rode down all obstacles. Teaching, of course, was now quite out of the question. No English parent could entrust the education of his daughters to the hand of a woman who has dared and suffered much for conscience' sake in the cause of freedom for herself and her sisters. But even before Herminia went away to Perugia, she had acquired some small journalistic connection. And now, in her hour of need, she found not a few of the journalistic leaders by no means unwilling to sympathise and fraternise with her. To be sure, they didn't ask the free woman to their homes, nor invite her to meet their own women. Even an enlightened journalist must draw a line somewhere in the matter of society. But they understood and appreciated the sincerity of her motives, and did what they could to find employment and salary for her. Herminia was an honest and conscientious worker. She knew much about many things, and nature had gifted her with the instinctive power of writing clearly and unaffectedly the English language, so she got on with editors. Who could resist, indeed, the pathetic charm of that girlish figure, simply clad in unobtrusive black, and sanctified in every feature of the shrinking face by the beauty of sorrow? Not the men who stand at the head of the one English profession which more than all others has escaped the leprous taint of that national moral blight that calls itself respectability. In a slow and tentative way, then, Herminia crept back into unrecognised recognition. It was all she needed. Companionship she liked. She hated society. That mart was odious to her, where women barter their bodies for a title, a carriage, a place at the head of some rich man's table. Bohemia sufficed her. Her terrible widowhood, too, was rendered less terrible to her by the care of her little one. Babbling lips, pattering feet made heaven in her attic. Every good woman is by nature a mother, and finds best in maternity her social and moral salvation. She shall be saved in childbearing. Herminia was far removed indeed from that blatant and decadent sect of advanced women who talk as though motherhood were a disgrace and a burden, instead of being, as it is, the full realization of woman's faculties, the natural outlet for woman's wealth of emotion. She knew that to be a mother is the best privilege of her sex, a privilege of which unholy man-made institutions now conspire to deprive half the finest and noblest women in our civilized communities. Widowed as she was, she still pitied the unhappy beings doomed to the cramped life and dwarfed heart of the old maid; pitied them as sincerely as she despised those unhealthy souls who would make of celibacy, wedded or unwedded, a sort of anti-natural religion for women. Alan's death, however, had left Herminia's ship rudderless. Her mission had failed, that she acknowledged herself. She lived now for Dolores. The child to whom she had given the noble birthright of liberty was destined from her cradle to the apostolate of women. Alone of her sex, she would start in life emancipated. While others must say, "With a great sum obtained I this freedom," Dolores could answer with Paul, "But I was free born." That was no mean heritage. Gradually Herminia got work to her mind, work enough to support her in the modest way that sufficed her small wants for herself and her baby. In London, given time enough, you can live down anything, perhaps even the unspeakable sin of having struck a righteous blow in the interest of women. And day by day, as months and years went on, Herminia felt she was living down the disgrace of having obeyed an enlightened conscience. She even found friends. Dear old Miss Smith-Waters used to creep round by night, like Nicodemus. Respectability would not have allowed her to perform that Christian act in open daylight, and sit for an hour or two with her dear misguided Herminia. Miss Smith-Waters prayed nightly for Herminia's conversion, yet not without an uncomfortable suspicion, after all, that Herminia had very little indeed to be converted from. Other people also got to know her by degrees: an editor's wife, a kind literary hostess, some socialistic ladies who liked to be advanced, a friendly family or two of the Bohemian literary or artistic pattern. Among them, Herminia learned to be as happy in time as she could ever again be, now she had lost her Alan. She was Mrs. Barton to them all. That lie she found it practically impossible to fight against. Even the Bohemians refused to let their children ask after Miss Barton's baby. So wrapped in vile falsehoods and conventions are we. So far have we travelled from the pristine realities of truth and purity. We lie to our children in the interests of morality. After a time, in the intervals between doing her journalistic work and nursing Alan's baby, Herminia found leisure to write a novel. It was seriously meant, of course, but still it was a novel. That is every woman's native idea of literature. It reflects the relatively larger part which the social life plays in the existence of women. If a man tells you he wants to write a book, 9 times out of 10 he means a treatise or argument on some subject that interests him. Even the men who take in the end to writing novels have generally begun with other aims and other aspirations, and have only fallen back upon the art of fiction in the last resort as a means of livelihood. But when a woman tells you she wants to write a book, 9 times out of 10 she means she wants to write a novel. For that task nature has most often endowed her richly. Her quicker intuitions, her keener interest in social life, her deeper insight into the passing play of emotions and of motives enable her to paint well the complex interrelations of everyday existence. So Herminia, like the rest, wrote her own pet novel. By the time her baby was 18 months old, she had finished it. It was blankly pessimistic, of course. Blank pessimism is the one creed possible for all save fools. To hold any other is to curl yourself up selfishly in your own easy-chair and say to your soul, "O soul, eat and drink. O soul, make merry, carouse thy fill. Ignore the maimed lives, the stricken heads and seared hearts, the reddened fangs and ravening claws of nature all round thee. Pessimism is sympathy. Optimism is selfishness. The optimist folds his smug hands on his ample knees and murmurs contentedly, "The Lord has willed it. There must always be rich and poor. Nature has, after all, her great law of compensation." The pessimist knows well self-deception like that is either a fraud or a blind, and recognising the seething mass of misery at his doors, gives what he can, his pity, or, where possible, his faint aid, in redressing the crying inequalities and injustices of man or nature. All honest art is therefore of necessity pessimistic. Herminia's romance was something more than that. It was the despairing heart-cry of a soul in revolt. It embodied the experiences and beliefs and sentiments of a martyred woman. It enclosed a lofty ethical purpose. She wrote it with fiery energy, for her baby's sake, on waste scraps of paper, at stray moments snatched from endless other engagements. And as soon as it was finished, she sent it in fear and trembling to a publisher. She had chosen her man well. He was a thinker himself, and he sympathised with thinkers. Though doubtful as to the venture, he took all the risk himself, with that generosity one so often sees in the best abused of professions. In 3 or 4 weeks' time, A Woman's World came out, and Herminia waited in breathless anxiety for the verdict of the reviewers. For nearly a month she waited in vain. Then, one Friday, as she was returning by underground railway from the Strand to Edgware Road, with Dolores in her arms, her eye fell as she passed upon the display bill of the Spectator. 6pence was a great deal of money to Herminia, but bang it went recklessly when she saw among the contents an article headed "A Very Advanced Woman's Novel." She felt sure it must be hers, and she was not mistaken. Breathlessly she ran over that first estimate of her work. It was with no little elation that she laid down the number. Not that the critique was by any means at all favourable. How could Herminia expect it in such a quarter? But the Spectator is at least conspicuously fair, though it remains in other ways an interesting and ivy-clad mediaeval relic. "Let us begin by admitting," said the spectatorial scribe, "that Miss Montague's book" (she had published it under a pseudonym) "is a work of genius. Much as we dislike its whole tone, and still more its conclusions, the gleam of pure genius shines forth undeniable on every page of it. Whoever takes it up must read on against his will till he has finished the last line of this terrible tragedy. A hateful fascination seems to hold and compel him. Its very purity makes it dangerous. The book is mistaken. The book is poisonous. The book is morbid. The book is calculated to do irremediable mischief. But in spite of all that, the book is a book of undeniable and sadly misplaced genius." If he had said no more, Herminia would have been amply satisfied. To be called morbid by the Spectator is a sufficient proof that you have hit at least the right tack in morals. And to be accused of genius as well was indeed a triumph. No wonder Herminia went home to her lonely attic that night, justifiably elated. She fancied after this her book must make a hit. It might be blamed and reviled, but at any rate it was now safe from the ignominy of oblivion. Alas, how little she knew of the mysteries of the book market! As little as all the rest of us. Day after day from that afternoon forth she watched in vain for succeeding notices. Not a single other paper in England reviewed her. At the libraries her romance was never so much as asked for. And the reason for these phenomena is not far to seek by those who know the ways of the British public. For her novel was earnestly and sincerely written, it breathed a moral air, therefore it was voted dull, therefore nobody cared for it. The Spectator had noticed it because of its manifest earnestness and sincerity. For though the Spectator is always on the side of the lie and the wrong, it is earnest and sincere, and has a genuine sympathy for earnestness and sincerity, even on the side of truth and righteousness. Nobody else even looked at it. People said to themselves, "This book seems to be a book with a teaching not thoroughly banal, like the novels with a purpose after which we flock. So we'll give it a wide berth." And they shunned it accordingly. That was the end of Herminia Barton's literary aspirations. She had given the people of her best, and the people rejected it. Now she gave them of her most mediocre, the nearest to their own level of thought and feeling to which her hand could reduce itself. And the people accepted it. The rest of her life was hack work. By that she could at least earn a living for Dolores. Her Antigone for the use of ladies' schools still holds its own at Girton and Somerville. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. I do not propose to dwell at any length upon the next 10 or 12 years of Herminia Barton's life. An episode or two must suffice, and those few told briefly. She saw nothing of her family. Relations had long been strained between them, now they were ruptured. To the rest of the Bartons she was even as one dead. The sister and daughter's name was never pronounced among them. But once, when little Dolores was about 5 years old, Herminia happened to pass a church door in Marylebone, where a red-lettered placard announced in bold type that the Very Reverend the Dean of Dunwich would preach there on Sunday. It flashed across her mind that this was Sunday morning. An overpowering desire to look on her father's face once more, she had never seen her mother's, impelled Herminia to enter those unwonted portals. The Dean was in the pulpit. He looked stately and dignified in his long white hair, a noticeable man, tall and erect to the last, like a storm-beaten pine. In spite of his 80 years and 10, his clear-cut face shone thoughtful and striking and earnest as ever. He was preaching from the text, "I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling." And he preached as he always did, eloquently. His river of speech flowed high between banks out of sight of the multitude. There was such perfect sincerity, such moral elevation in all he said, that Herminia felt acutely, as she had often felt before, the close likeness of fibre which united her to him, in spite of extreme superficial differences of belief and action. She felt it so much that when the sermon was over, she waited at the vestry door for her father to emerge. She couldn't let him go away without making at least an effort to speak with him. When the Dean came out, a gentle smile still playing upon his intellectual face, for he was one of the few parsons who manage in their old age to look neither sordid nor inane, he saw standing by the vestry door a woman in a plain black dress, like a widow of the people. She held by the hand a curly-haired little girl of singularly calm and innocent expression. The woman's dark hair waved gracefully on her high forehead and caught his attention. Her eyes were subtly sweet, her mouth full of pathos. She pressed forward to speak to him. The Dean, all benignity, bent his head to listen. "Father!" Herminia cried, looking up at him. The Dean started back. The woman who thus addressed him was barely 28. She might well have been 40. Grief and hard life had made her old before her time. Her face was haggard. Beautiful as she still was, it was the beauty of a broken heart, of a Mater Dolorosa, not the round-faced beauty of the fresh young girl who had gone forth rejoicing some 10 years earlier from the deanery at Dunwich to the lecture rooms at Girton. For a moment the Dean stared hard at her. Then, with a burst of recognition, he uttered aghast the one word, "Herminia!" "Father," Herminia answered in a tremulous voice, "I have fought a good fight. I have pressed toward the mark for the prize of a high calling. And when I heard you preach, I felt just this once, let come what come might, I must step forth to tell you so." The Dean gazed at her with melting eyes. Love and pity beamed strong in them. "Have you come to repent, my child?" he asked, with solemn insistence. "Father," Herminia made answer, lingering lovingly on the word, "I have nothing to repent of. I have striven hard to do well, and have earned scant praise for it. But I come to ask to-day for one grasp of your hand, one word of your blessing. Father, father, kiss me." The old man drew himself up to his full height, with his silvery hair round his face. Tears started to his eyes, his voice faltered, but he repressed himself sternly. "No, no, my child," he answered. "My poor old heart bleeds for you, but not till you come with full proofs of penitence in your hands can I ever receive you. I have prayed for you without ceasing. God grant you may repent. Till then, I command you, keep far away from me and from your untainted sisters." The child felt her mother's hand tremble quivering in her own as she led her from the church. But never a word did Herminia say, lest her heart should break with it. As soon as she was outside, little Dolly looked up at her. It had dwindled from Dolores to Dolly in real life by this time. Years bring these mitigations of our first fierce outbursts. "Who was that grand old gentleman?" the child asked in an awe-struck voice. And Herminia, clasping her daughter to her breast, answered with a stifled sob, "That was your grandpa, Dolly. That was my father, my father." The child put no more questions just then, as is the wont of children. But she treasured up the incident for long in her heart, wondering much to herself why, if her grandpa was so grand an old gentleman, she and her mamma should have to live by themselves in such scrubby little lodgings. Also, why her grandpa, who looked so kind, should refuse so severely to kiss her mammy. It was the beginning of many doubts and questionings to Dolores. A year later, the Dean died suddenly. People said he might have risen to be a bishop in his time if it hadn't been for that unfortunate episode about his daughter and young Merrick. Herminia was only once mentioned in his will, and even then merely to implore the divine forgiveness for her. She wept over that sadly. She didn't want the girl's money. She was better able to take care of herself than Elsie and Ermyntrude. But it cut her to the quick that her father should have quitted the world at last without one word of reconciliation. However, she went on working placidly at her hack work, and living for little Dolly. Her one wish now was to make Dolly press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling she herself, by mere accident, had missed so narrowly. Her own life was done. Alan's death had made her task impossible. But if Dolly could fill her place for the sake of humanity, she would not regret it. Enough for her to have martyred herself. She asked no mercenary palm and crown of martyrdom. And she was happy in her life. As far as a certain tranquil sense of duty done could make her, she was passively happy. Her kind of journalism was so commonplace and so anonymous that she was spared that worst insult of seeing her hack work publicly criticised as though it afforded some adequate reflection of the mind that produced it, instead of being merely an index of taste in the minds of those for whose use it was intended. So she lived for years, a machine for the production of articles and reviews, and a devoted mother to little developing Dolly. On Dolly the hopes of half the world now centred. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Not that Herminia had not at times hard struggles and sore temptations. One of the hardest and sorest came when Dolly was about 6 years old, and this was the manner of it. One day, the child who was to reform the world was returning from some errand on which her mother had sent her, when her attention was attracted by a very fine carriage stopping at a door not far from their lodgings. Now, Dolly had always a particular weakness for everything grand, and so grand a turnout as this one was rare in their neighbourhood. She paused and stared hard at it. "Whose is it, Mrs. Biggs?" she asked, awestruck, of the friendly charwoman who happened to pass at the moment, the charwoman who frequently came in to do a day's cleaning at her mother's lodging-house. Mrs. Biggs knew it well. "It's Sir Anthony Merrick's," she answered, in that peculiarly hushed voice with which the English poor always utter the names of the titled classes. And so, in fact, it was, for the famous gout doctor had lately been knighted for his eminent services in saving a royal duke from the worst effects of his own self-indulgence. Dolly put one fat finger to her lip and elevated her eyebrows and looked grave at once. Sir Anthony Merrick! What a very grand gentleman he must be indeed! And how nice it must seem to be able to drive in so distinguished a vehicle with a liveried footman. As she paused and looked, lost in enjoyment of that beatific vision, Sir Anthony himself emerged from the porch. Dolly took a good stare at him. He was handsome, austere, close-shaven, implacable. His profile was clear-cut, like Trajan's on an aureus. Dolly thought that was just how so grand a gentleman ought to look, and so thinking, she glanced up at him, and with a flash of her white teeth smiled her childish approval. The austere old gentleman, unwontedly softened by that cherub face, for indeed she was as winsome as a baby angel of Raphael's, stooped down and patted the bright curly head that turned up to him so trustfully. "What's your name, little woman?" he asked, with a sudden wave of gentleness. And Dolly, all agog at having arrested so grand an old gentleman's attention, spoke up in her clear treble, "Dolores Barton." Sir Anthony started. Was this a trap to entangle him? He was born suspicious, and he feared that woman. But he looked into Dolly's blue eyes of wonder, and all doubt fled from him. Was it blood? Was it instinct? Was it unconscious nature? At any rate, the child seemed to melt the grandfather's heart as if by magic. Long years after, when the due time came, Dolly remembered that melting. To the profound amazement of the footman, who stood with the carriage door ready open in his hand, the old man bent down and kissed the child's red lips. "God bless you, my dear," he murmured with unwonted tenderness to his son's daughter. Then he took out his purse and drew from it a whole gold sovereign. "That's for you, my child," he said, fondling the pretty golden curls. "Take it home and tell your mammy an old man in the street gave it to you." But the coachman observed to the footman, as they drove on together to the next noble patient's, "You may take your oath on it, Mr. Wells, that little 'un there was Mr. Allen's love-child." Dolly had never held so much money in her hand before. She ran home clutching it tight, and burst in upon Herminia with the startling news that Sir Anthony Merrick, a very grand gentleman in a very fine carriage, had given a gold piece to her. Gold pieces were rare in the calm little attic, but Herminia caught her child up with a cry of terror, and that very same evening she changed the tainted sovereign with Dolly for another one, and sent Sir Anthony's back in an envelope, without a word, to Harley Street. The child who was born to free half the human race from aeons of slavery must be kept from all contagion of man's gold and man's bribery. Yet Dolly never forgot the grand gentleman's name, though she hadn't the least idea why he gave that yellow coin to her. Out of this small episode, however, grew Herminia's great temptation. For Sir Anthony, being a man tenacious of his purpose, went home that day full of relenting thoughts about that girl Dolores. Her golden hair had sunk deep into his heart. She was Alan's own child, after all. She had Alan's blue eyes. And in a world where your daughters go off and marry men you don't like, while your sons turn out badly and don't marry at all to vex you, it's something to have some fresh young life of your blood to break in upon your chilly old age and cheer you. So the great doctor called a few days later at Herminia's lodgings, and having first ascertained that Herminia herself was out, had 5 minutes' conversation alone with her landlady. There were times, no doubt, when Mrs. Barton was ill. The landlady, with the caution of her class, admitted that might be so. And times, no doubt, when Mrs. Barton was for the moment in arrears with her rent. The landlady, good, loyal soul, demurred to that suggestion. She knit her brows and hesitated. Sir Anthony hastened to set her mind at rest. His intentions were most friendly. He wished to keep a watch, a quiet, well-meaning, unsuspected watch, over Mrs. Barton's necessities. He desired, in point of fact, if need were, to relieve them. Mrs. Barton was distantly connected with relations of his own, and his notion was that without seeming to help her in obtrusive ways, he would like to make sure Mrs. Barton got into no serious difficulties. Would the landlady be so good— a half-sovereign glided into that subservient palm— as to let Sir Anthony know if she ever had reason to suspect a very serious strain was being put on Mrs. Barton's resources? The landlady, dropping the modern apology for a courtesy, promised with effusion under pressure of hard cash to accede to Sir Anthony's benevolent wishes. The more so as she'd do anything to serve dear Mrs. Barton, who was always in everything a perfect lady, most independent, in fact, one of the kind as wouldn't be beholden to anybody for a farthing. Some months passed away before the landlady had cause to report to Sir Anthony. But during the worst depths of the next London winter, when grey fog gathered thick in the purlieus of Marylebone, and shivering gusts groaned at the street corners, poor little Dolly caught whooping cough badly. On top of the whooping cough came an attack of bronchitis, and on top of the bronchitis a serious throat trouble. Herminia sat up night after night nursing her child, and neglecting the work on which both depended for subsistence. Week by week things grew worse and worse, and Sir Anthony, kept duly informed by the landlady, waited and watched, and bided his time in silence. At last the case became desperate. Herminia had no money left to pay her bill or buy food, and one string to her bow after another broke down in journalism. Her place as the weekly lady's letter writer to an illustrated paper passed on to a substitute. Blank poverty stared her in the face, inevitable. When it came to pawning the typewriter, as the landlady reported, Sir Anthony smiled a grim smile to himself. The moment for action had now arrived. He would put on pressure to get away poor Alan's illegitimate child from that dreadful woman. Next day he called. Dolly was dangerously ill. So ill that Herminia couldn't find it in her heart to dismiss the great doctor from her door without letting him see her. And Sir Anthony saw her. The child recognised him at once and rallied and smiled at him. She stretched her little arms. She must surely get well if a gentleman who drove in so fine a carriage and scattered sovereigns like halfpennies came in to prescribe for her. Sir Anthony was flattered at her friendly reception. Those thin, small arms touched the grandfather's heart. "She will recover," he said, "but she needs good treatment, delicacies, refinements." Then he slipped out of the room and spoke seriously to Herminia. "Let her come to me," he urged. "I'll adopt her and give her her father's name. It will be better for herself, better for her future. She shall be treated as my granddaughter, well taught, well kept, and you may see her every 6 months for a fortnight's visit. If you consent, I will allow you 100 a year for yourself. Let bygones be bygones. For the child's sake, say yes. She needs so much that you can never give her." Poor Herminia was sore tried. As for the 100 a year, she couldn't dream of accepting it. But, like a flash, it went through her brain how many advantages Dolly could enjoy in that wealthy household that the hard-working journalist could not possibly afford her. She thought of the unpaid bills, the empty cupboard, the wolf at the door, the blank outlook for the future. For a second she half hesitated. "Come, come," Sir Anthony said, "for the child's own sake. You won't be so selfish as to stand in her way, will you?" Those words roused Herminia to a true sense of her duty. "Sir Anthony Merrick," she said, holding her breath, "that child is my child, and my dear dead Alan's. I owe it to Alan, I owe it to her, to bring her up in the way that Alan would approve of. I brought her into the world, and my duty is to do what I can to discharge the responsibilities I then undertook to her. I must train her up to be a useful citizen. Not for thousands would I resign the delight and honour of teaching my child to those who would teach her what Alan and I believed to be pernicious, who would teach her to despise her mother's life and to reject the holy memory of her father. As I said to you before, that day at Perugia, so I say to you now, thy money perish with thee. You need never again come here to bribe me." "Is that final?" Sir Anthony asked. And Herminia answered with a bow, "Yes, final, quite final." Sir Anthony bent his head and left. Herminia stood face to face with abject poverty. spurred by want, by indignation, by terror, by a sense of the absolute necessity for action, she carried her writing materials then and there into Dolly's sick room, and sitting by her child's cot, she began to write, she hardly knew what, as the words themselves came to her. In a fever of excitement she wrote and wrote and wrote. She wrote as one writes in the silence of midnight. It was late before she finished. When her manuscript was complete, she slipped out and posted it to a weekly paper. It appeared that same Saturday, and was the beginning of Herminia's most valuable connection. But even after she had posted it, the distracted mother could not pause or rest. Dolly tossed and turned in her sleep, and Herminia sat watching her. She pined for sympathy. Vague ancestral yearnings, gathering head within her, made her long to pray. If only there had been anybody or anything to pray to. She clasped her bloodless hands in an agony of solitude. Oh, for a friend to comfort! At last her overwrought feelings found vent in verse. She seized a pencil from her desk, and sitting by Dolly's side, wrote down her heartfelt prayer as it came to her that moment. A crowned caprice is God of the world. On his stony breast are his white wings furled. No ear to hearken, no eye to see, no heart to feel for a man hath he. But his pitiless hands are swift to smite, and his mute lips utter one word of might in the clash of gentler souls and rougher. Wrong must thou do, or wrong must suffer. Then grant, O dumb, blind God, at least that we rather the sufferers than the doers be. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. A change came at last when Dolly was 10 years old. Among the men of whom Herminia saw most in these later days were the little group of advanced London socialists who called themselves the Fabians. And among her Fabian friends one of the most active, the most eager, the most individual, was Harvey Kynaston. He was a younger man by many years than poor Alan had been, about Herminia's own age. A brilliant economist with a future before him, he aimed at the cabinet. When first he met Herminia, he was charmed at one glance by her chastened beauty, her breadth and depth of soul, her transparent sincerity of purpose and action. Those wistful eyes captured him. Before many days passed, he had fallen in love with her. But he knew her history, and taking it for granted she must still be immersed in regret for Alan's loss, he hardly even reckoned the chances of her caring for him. 'Tis a common case. Have you ever noticed that if you meet a woman famous for her connection with some absorbing grief, some historic tragedy, you are half appalled at first sight to find that at times she can laugh and make merry and look gay with the rest of us? Her callous glee shocks you. You mentally expect her to be for ever engaged in the tearful contemplation of her own tragic fate, wrapped up in those she has lost, like the mourners in a Pietà. Whenever you have thought of her, you have connected her in your mind with that one fact in her history, which perhaps may have happened a great many years ago, but to you it is as yesterday. You forget that since then many things have occurred to her. She has lived her life. She has learned to smile. Human nature itself cannot feed for years on the continuous contemplation of its own deepest sorrows. It even jars you to find that the widow of a patriotic martyr, a murdered missionary, has her moments of enjoyment, and must wither away without them. So, just at first, Harvey Kynaston was afraid to let Herminia see how sincerely he admired her. He thought of her rather as one whose life is spent, who can bring to the banquet but the cold dead ashes of a past existence. Gradually, however, as he saw more and more of her, it began to strike him that Herminia was still in all essentials a woman. His own throbbing heart told him so as he sat and talked with her. He thrilled at her approach. Bit by bit, the idea rose up in his mind that this lonely soul might still be won. He set to work in earnest to woo and win her. As for Herminia, many men had paid her attentions already in her unwedded widowhood. Some of them, after the fashion of men, having heard garbled versions of her tragic story, and seeking to gain some base advantage for themselves from their knowledge of her past, strove to assail her crudely. Them, with unerring womanly instinct, she early discerned, and with unerring feminine tact, undeceived and humbled. Others, genuinely attracted by her beauty and her patience, paid real court to her heart, but all these fell far short of her ideal standard. With Harvey Kynaston it was different. She admired him as a thinker, she liked him as a man, and she felt from the first moment that no friend since Alan died had stirred her pulse so deeply as he did. For some months they met often at the Fabian meetings and elsewhere, till at last it became a habit with them to spend their Sunday mornings on some breezy wold in the country together. Herminia was still as free as ever from any shrinking terror as to what people might say. As of old, she lived her life for herself and her conscience, not for the opinion of a blind and superstitious majority. On one such August morning they had taken the train from London to Haslemere, with Dolly, of course, by their side, and then had strolled up Hind Head by the beautiful footpath which mounts at first through a chestnut copse and then between heather-clad hills to the summit. At the loneliest turn of the track, where two purple glens divide, Harvey Kynaston seated himself on the soft bed of ling. Herminia sank by his side, and Dolly, after a while, not understanding their conversation, wandered off by herself a little way afield in search of harebells and spotted orchises. Dolly found her mother's friends were apt to bore her. She preferred the society of the landlady's daughters. It was a delicious day. Hard by, a slowworm sunned himself on the basking sand. Blue dragonflies flashed on gauze wings in the hollows. Harvey Kynaston looked on Herminia's face and saw that she was fair. With an effort he made up his mind to speak at last. In plain and simple words he asked her reverently the same question that Alan had asked her so long ago on the Holmwood. Herminia's throat flushed a rosy red, and an unwonted sense of pleasure stole over that hard-worked frame as she listened to his words. For indeed she was fond of him. But she answered him at once without a moment's hesitation. "Harvey, I'm glad you asked me, for I like and admire you. But I feel sure beforehand my answer must be no. For I think what you mean is to ask, will I marry you?" The man gazed at her hard. He spoke low and deferentially. "Yes, Herminia," he replied. "I do mean, will you marry me? I know, of course, how you feel about this matter. I know what you have sacrificed, how deeply you have suffered for the sake of your principles. And that's just why I plead with you now to ignore them. You have given proof long ago of your devotion to the right. You may surely fall back this second time upon the easier way of ordinary humanity. In theory, Herminia, I accept your point of view. I approve the equal liberty of men and women, politically, socially, personally, ethically. But in practice, I don't want to bring unnecessary trouble on the head of a woman I love. And to live together otherwise than as the law directs does bring unnecessary trouble, as you know too profoundly. That is the only reason why I ask you to marry me. And, Herminia, Herminia," he leant forward appealingly, "for the love's sake I bear you, I hope you will consent to it." His voice was low and tender. Herminia, sick at heart with that long, fierce struggle against overwhelming odds, could almost have said yes to him. Her own nature prompted her. She was very, very fond of him. But she paused for a second. Then she answered him gravely. "Harvey," she said, looking deep into his honest brown eyes, "as we grow middle-aged, and find how impossible it must ever be to achieve any good in a world like this, how sad a fate it is to be born a civilized being in a barbaric community, I'm afraid moral impulse half dies down within us. The passionate aim grows cold, the ardent glow fades and flickers into apathy. I'm ashamed to tell you the truth. It seems such weakness. Yet, as you ask me this, I think I will tell you. Once upon a time, if you had made such a proposal to me, if you had urged me to be false to my dearest principles, to sin against the light, to deny the truth, I would have flashed forth a no upon you without one moment's hesitation. And now, in my disillusioned middle age, what do I feel? Do you know, I almost feel tempted to give way to this Martinmas summer of love, to stultify my past by unsaying and undoing everything. For I love you, Harvey. If I were to give way now, as George Eliot gave way, as almost every woman who once tried to live a free life for her sister's sake has given way in the end, I should counteract any little good my example has ever done or may ever do in the world. And, Harvey, strange as it sounds, I feel more than half inclined to do it. But I will not, and I'll tell you why. It's not so much principle that prevents me now, I admit that freely. The torpor of middle age is creeping over my conscience. It's simple regard for personal consistency, and for Dolly's position. How can I go back upon the faith for which I have martyred myself? How can I say to Dolly, I wouldn't marry your father in my youth for honour's sake, but I have consented in middle life to sell my sister's cause for a man I love, and for the consideration of society, to rehabilitate myself too late with a world I despise by becoming one man's slave, as I swore I never would be. No, no, dear Harvey, I can't do that. Some sense of personal continuity restrains me still. It is the nemesis of our youth. We can't go back in our later life on the holier and purer ideals of our girlhood. "Then you say no, definitely?" Harvey Kynaston asked. Herminia's voice quivered. "I say no, definitely," she answered, "unless you can consent to live with me on the terms on which I lived with Dolly's father." The man hesitated a moment. Then he began to plead hard for reconsideration. But Herminia's mind was made up. She couldn't belie her past. She couldn't be false to the principles for whose sake she had staked and lost everything. "No, no," she said firmly, over and over again. "You must take me my own way. or you must go without me." And Harvey Kynaston couldn't consent to take her own way. His faith was too weak, his ambitions were too earthly. "Herminia," he said, before they parted that afternoon, "we may still be friends, still dear friends as ever. This episode need make no difference to a very close companionship." "It need make no difference," Herminia answered, with a light touch of her hand. "Harvey, I have far too few friends in the world willingly to give up one of them. Come again and go down with Dolly and me to Hindhead, as usual, next Sunday." "Thank you," the man answered. "Herminia, I wish it could have been otherwise. But since I must never have you, I can promise you one thing. I will never marry any other woman." Herminia started at the words. "Oh, no!" she cried quickly. "How can you speak like that? How can you say anything so wrong, so untrue, so foolish? To be celibate is a very great misfortune even for a woman. For a man it is impossible. It is cruel. It is wicked. I endure it myself for my child's sake, and because I find it hard to discover the helpmeet for me, or because, when discovered, he refuses to accept me in the only way in which I can bestow myself. But for a man to pretend to live celibate is to cloak hateful wrong under a guise of respectability. I should be unhappy if I thought any man was doing such a vicious thing out of desire to please me. Take some other woman on free terms if you can, but if you cannot, it is better you should marry than be a party to still deeper and more loathsome slavery." And from that day forth they were loyal friends, no more, one to the other. End of chapter 16.